Hey, can I talk to you about pleasure? Hello and welcome. I'm Zylla. This is my Athenaeum. Today I want to talk to you about hedonism. You know, the Greek philosophy. Okay, I tease. I like to tease. But we really are going to talk about Greek philosophy, and pleasure, and modern sensuality. We'll start with some very chaste basics, and build up to a little bit more indulgence, shall we? Hedone is the Greek word for pleasure. You might recognize the term, or rather its opposite, from the common depressive symptom anhedonia, a state in which nothing induces pleasure. To be honest, the best representation I've ever seen of anhedonia is from the Pixar movie Inside Out, when the console goes dark.
Guys, we can't make Riley feel anything.
What have we done?
It's not rage, it's not sorrow or grief, it's the inability to feel. And so you can see that pleasure is fairly central to how we as human beings function. If you don't enjoy what you're doing, you aren't going to get much done. When we talk about the philosophical concept of hedonism, it's much closer to that sense of hedone than our modern ear might suspect. You see, pleasure, in that sense, is the spark of all choices, the driving force that generates all life. And that's where we begin, with natural philosophers in the Greek-colonized coast of Ionia, what is now Western Turkey. Now, other philosophers like Thales and Anaximander aren't yet quite concerned directly with pleasure. They're more asking the question, what is the world? Is it fundamentally made of an element like water or fire, or perhaps organized by some particular principle of mind? This is the birthplace of both hedonism and atomic theory. Physics as we know it, and the inherent enjoyment of the physical world are intertwined, inseparable. It's this drive, this curiosity to know what sensations are out there that really gets us off of square one. Our favorite party boy, Socrates, that dirty old goat going around at drinking parties just to be accosted by his ex Alcibiades, who was messily looking for one last shag for old time's sake. They say he was heavily influenced by these Ionian philosophers. And certainly strands of Pythagorean theory can be found in his concepts of, for instance, the search for pure forms. Now, various sources in both the ancient and relatively modern world have claimed that Socrates was taught by Parmenides or Archelaus, both fine inheritors of the Ionian philosopher name. The only teacher that Socrates and his students ever mention directly is Aspasia, who was herself from the Ionian city of Miletus, where Thales and his ilk worked their wiles. Well, and supposedly Diotima, who taught him the principles of love. Most people think that's just Aspasia's dom name anyway. Aspasia was the wife of Pericles, a great orator and statesman who led Athens on a grand project of empire building. According to Socrates via his student Plato, Diotima was a seer who foresaw and forestalled several major tragedies, including the plague later blamed on Pericles' policies. You pondering what I'm pondering there? Writers always say Aspasia was a whore. but you just really can't trust men to be reasonable about something as amazing as an ancient philosopher queen. Whatever the case may be, Socrates was no longer interested so much in what the world is, but in what is best in life.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women. That is good.
This sea lion of a man who refuses to go home because he's fighting with his wife, standing around on street corners accosting young men about whether they can know anything for certain, he was interested in virtue. At least, that's usually how the word arete is translated. However amusing we may find that picture, his words clearly had an effect. People came from all over the known world to learn at Socrates' feet. You've probably heard of at least Plato and his follower Aristotle. You might even have heard of Xenophon, another of Socrates' students. But there were others. And it's one named Aristippus of Cyrene that I want to turn my attention to now. You see, Aristippus saw his teacher Socrates being feasted all around the city, enjoying food and wine and sex, if largely in moderation. And Aristippus said to himself, you know, that's what's best in life. Who cares about virtue? Virtue lands you in a cell drinking hemlock.
Here's your hemlock. Ah, thank you.
I want to live here and now and enjoy it. And Aristippus thought to himself, why would we focus on virtue? The Cyrenaic school founded by Aristippus is considered the first hedonistic philosophy by many people. We don't have Aristippus's writings, they didn't survive, unlike his bitter rival Plato, but we do have an idea of his principles. Embrace joy and wine and love. Live for the moment and live for yourself. In the end, he named his daughter the successor to his school and its philosophies. Her name was Arete. Humor or bitter irony? You tell me. But honest to goodness, Hedonismus, what we call hedonism as a philosophy, wasn't founded by one of the Cyrenaics. It was an Athenian named Epicurus who plowed that particular field. Epicurus set up a school in direct opposition to Plato's. He called it the Garden. Now, he was interested in pleasure as a fundamental force, in pleasure as a motivator and a general good in and of itself, but not just in the here and now. He was very invested in the idea of eliminating pain and suffering from as many lives for as long as possible. He even let slaves and even women into the garden. In other words, Comrade Epicurus was based AF. Pleasure for Epicurus went well beyond the here and now. In order to reduce suffering in your own life, you weigh the momentary unpleasantness of a task before you against the good you will reap of having done it. In order to reduce pain and suffering in your children's lives, you weigh the unpleasantness of your toil against the benefit they will reap in the next generation. You look to your own future, for instance, in seeing a luxury-laden and spendthrift present as a detriment to your future self's pleasure. For the pain of poverty is worse than a moment's moderation. In other words, pleasure itself is a virtue. The good life well lived is full of it, and everyone should be able to reap the benefits. None of this abstract and airy search for purity of Plato, no future crystallized society in which perhaps women could be equals if everything falls out right, no cave full of shadows. This is very material, here and now, and Epicurus managed to improve the lives of slaves and women despite present conditions for him without having to uproot everything first. And when later philosopher Lucretius wrote his work De Rerum Natura about the natural world, it's Epicurus that he turns to as the truth, as the man who quite literally saw behind the curtain, who lifted up the veil of reality, saw its underpinnings, and came back to tell humanity about it. This is a man who did not believe in the gods, but he spends an extended passage describing, as metaphor, pleasure, Aphrodite, as the generative force behind all things. Okay, I say Aphrodite, but Venus. Romans, you know? What I'm getting at here is that Epicurean hedonism is driven by this procreative, generative pleasure, hedone, that it is the virtue that drives the entire world. It's not heedless abandon in passion or the cold abstraction of ideals. It's careful husbandry of a better world by concrete action. Now, whether or not Aristippus of the Cyrenaics believed in the virtue of sultry sensuality as the be-all, end-all of what life is about, as his rival Plato imputed to him, we can't say. But there have certainly been plenty of people who did and do. Perhaps the most famous example of a believer in complete and unrestrained sensuality is the Marquis de Sade, who believed in absolute devotion to sexual freedom and rejection of all of those moral quibbles around the edges. If you want to know more about that particular topic, I recommend that you check out Vivian Strange's expose. Suffice to say that living for whatever gets you turned on is a well-established way of life. But I'm not here to talk about the libertines, not really. I'm more interested in our modern conception, colloquially, of hedonism, and why it's so much closer to de Sade than to Epicurus. After all, anyone can pursue a life of simple pleasures, but it's only the rich who can ever get away with complete abandon and indulgence. Really, it all comes back to Christianity. Now, I'm going to pull a trick from Mickey Atkins here and give you a disclaimer. Hashtag not all Christians. When I'm talking here about Christianity, I'm not talking about all Christians or even all Christian sects. I'm talking about general trends in Christian philosophy and some of the toxic outcomes that they have. I'm not talking about your average normal Christian living an average normal life. If you happen to be religious, if this is a fundamental part of your community and your well-being, these criticisms are not about you. If you want to know my personal takes on religion, I recommend that you go see my series, Echoes of Jewish Identity. It'll be a nice 2.5-hour ride, and you can get a good sense of where I fall. I have nothing against Jesus Christ, Yeshua the Anointed, purported Son of God. He seemed like a pretty cool guy, all things considered. He tried to ease the suffering of those around him. He told off a bunch of rich asshats who were hoarding all of the wealth. And he hung out with sex workers and sick people. Pretty cool guy. I do have a lot of problems with some of the people who came afterwards. Paul in particular. What an arrogant, homophobic, misogynistic git. The part that's relevant to us right now is the emphasis on privation, the rejection of pleasure now in hopes of benefiting in a world yet to come, and the concept of sin. Christianity did not quite invent the concept of sin. The biblical scholar I spoke to about this said that there were trends in contemporaneous Judaism and similar concepts in some strains of Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. But she did confirm that it was Christianity that really centralized this pervasive and ultimately toxic focus on mind crime, on the sin against God. There's a quote from a Lois McMaster Buchholz story that I quite like about this. It indicates a deep confusion of thinking to mistake one's own suffering for benefit to another. But as far as I can tell, Christianity has been doing this its entire existence. Reject the pleasures of the flesh in order to please God. Even from the first adoption of Christianity into the Roman Empire, you find people abandoning their entire lives to live ascetically off in the woods or the desert, religious fervor overcoming their senses. Augustine, yes, that Augustine, wrote an entire miserable book about tormenting the soul by pleasuring the flesh and the soul's redemption by austerity. Now, I'm not saying that there's no benefit to regulating your desires and pleasures. What I'm saying is that the rejection of pleasure and desire seems to be here in and of itself seen as a good thing. This isn't a general Abrahamic thing, this is a Christian thing. It usually has more to do with power than with righteousness. The power of men over women. A man may be easily cleansed of the disgrace of a night at the brothel, but a woman's lust runs deep because it might result in a bastard child. The power of the rich over the poor. I was born a king, a knight, a landowner, and therefore I am inherently ordained by God as better than you peasant. But I will graciously forego a fourth Arabian stallion in order to give a bauble to the church. And Christianity in that mode is inherently tied into colonialism. The Roman Empire converted as a means to expansion, and when European colonizers set out, their explicit mission was to bring Christian morals to those ignorant savages living a fulfilled and complex but unchristian life of their own. If lust is a sin, then the free and open sexual congress found in indigenous societies, in the Americas, in Africa, in Australia, well, that must be a mark of their inferior character. Do you see how this goes? The Marquis de Sade was not infamous purely for his sexual conquests. Anyone with wealth and power could, and mostly did, do the same. No, it was that he was blasphemous and immoral in his unrestrained sexual exploits. And this denial of pleasure became even worse with the Protestants. The Puritans, who formed the basis of what is now known as American culture, the dominant ideas in the global marketplace, were literally centered around the denial of all pleasures, the rejection of every type of enjoyment because it made things impure. The idea was to cut off your enjoyment of the material world to avoid going to hell in the afterlife, even if it made your life on earth as miserable as any hell. This is the source of that Protestant work ethic that we're always on about. The grind, the hustle. Even if you're no Puritan, even if you're not Christian, you can't help but feel the constant pressure to always make more productivity, more work, more hustle, more content. Drain yourself dry to be a good citizen. Pleasure is relegated to a secondary or possibly tertiary position, a nice to have, not a generative and necessary force of life itself. Your stereotypical person goes to work from 9 in the morning to 5 in the evening, and then goes home to watch television for a couple of hours before they fall asleep. Is that a life well lived? And so, of course, under those circumstances, pleasure is considered sinful. I mean, maybe not the littlest things, a happy sigh at a beautiful sunset, or a dinner with friends. But then again, why is there even a phrase, so good it's sinful? And why does it mostly apply to food, which is literally necessary for life? Why is sex shameful. Why can't we talk about orgasms, which are a pure form of harmless pleasure for the majority of humanity? Why is it so taboo to talk about that most people don't even know that women can have them? Why are we so obsessed with restricting production or sale of relatively harmless drugs like Ritalin or marijuana or psilocybin when things like alcohol are legal? That we keep people who would benefit from them from having them? Is it that terrible that the occasional person might use them for funsies? We live in a society that punishes people for enjoyment. Add in capitalism, and you get hustle and grind culture. Everything must be monetized or it's a waste. Don't just enjoy your hobby. Make it into a second job or even a third one. Otherwise it's a waste. Don't do something just because you like it. Hedonism in the modern age is the breaking of this taboo. Doing things just for the pleasure of them and not making excuses for it. It's eating that piece of cake. It's having a fulfilling sex life. It's making art just because it's beautiful. And it's not only YouTube lefty video essayists who have noticed this, I promise you. Hedonism as a philosophy has never gone away, and probably never will. It's gone through many permutations, religious philosophies trying to co-opt and reframe it, utilitarian thinkers trying to confine and structure it. There's even, in recent times, been an effort to revive the old Cyrenaic school by one Michel Onfray. But the most important modern philosophy influenced by hedonism is abolition. Philosopher and activist David Pearce founded the Abolitionist Society, a group which calls for the eradication of suffering of all sentient beings. Attempts to pursue this range from veganism to medicines which may slow neurological decay. In fact, Pearce hails from a utilitarian branch known as transhumanism, a very misunderstood and misused word these days, which refers actually to the use of modern technology and medicine to alleviate human suffering. If Onfray seeks to recall the Cyrenaics, Pearce seems to be looking back equally to Epicurus, seeking not pleasure in and of itself, but the relief from suffering. It may not have escaped your notice, you clever little minx, you, that abolition outside transhumanist circles is not quite so broad a brushstroke. It tends to refer more to specifically the abolition of the carceral state, prisons, policing, human trafficking, and slavery. I would argue that this kind of abolition is necessary for the modern hedonist. How can you indulge yourself? How can you break that taboo? How can you bear to do it, knowing that you haven't done everything you can to alleviate the suffering of those around you? Can you live happily in Omelas, knowing the cost? I can't. That's why I'm here. And that, my dear viewer, is why you must remember that joy is a radical act, and pleasure is the seed of freedom. In an oppressive society, joy is a fire in the night that won't be quenched. It's a beacon, a spark of hope, a reminder of what we fight for. Productivity can't get you that. Only pleasure. And so it is important, my darling hedonists, to enjoy yourself, to celebrate Black joy, trans joy, Jewish joy, every minority's joy at being alive, at living despite. So go on, take a bite.